Karen Whitfield prided herself on being the neighborhood's unofficial watchdog. At 53, with her precisely maintained blonde bob and perpetual frown, she spent most afternoons perched by her living room window, documenting every violation of the Homeowners Association rules. Her neighbors had nicknamed her the sentinel behind her back, though most had simply avoided her penetrating gaze altogether. Karen's three-bedroom Tudor home on Maple Lane stood as a testament to her exacting standards. The lawn mowed to precisely 2.5 inches, the hedges trimmed into perfect rectangles, and seasonal flowers arranged by height and color coordination. The brass knocker on her burgundy front door gleamed from weekly polishing, and not a single holiday decoration ever appeared before or remained after the HOA-approved installation dates. Today began like any other Tuesday. Karen had spent the morning sending emails to the HOA board about the Johnsons' recycling bin left visible from the street and the Petersons' unapproved wind chimes. She just settled into her observation post, an antique wingback chair strategically positioned for maximum street visibility, with a cup of chamomile tea and her infractions notebook when something truly suspicious caught her attention. A dented, mud-splattered van with out-of-state license plates had parked directly across from her immaculate home. Karen set down her teacup with a sharp clink. The vehicle was at least 15 years old, with rust blooming around the wheel wells, a clear violation of the neighborhood covenant that prohibited unsightly vehicles from being parked on the street for more than 2 hours. More alarming were the two men who emerged from the van. Both wore dark clothing, hoodies pulled up despite the mild spring weather, and moved with what Karen immediately categorized as furtive behavior. The shorter one kept looking up and down the street while the taller man began unloading large, heavy-looking bags from the back of the van. Suspicious package, Karen muttered to herself, recalling the neighborhood watch presentation given by Officer Ramirez last month. She reached for her reading glasses to better observe the scene. The bags appeared heavy, requiring considerable effort to move, and were in irregular shape, not like normal luggage or grocery bags. Karen's pulse quickened as one of the men pointed toward the Henderson house. The Hendersons had been away for nearly 3 weeks now. Karen had been collecting their mail and watering their prized roses in their absence. Mrs. Henderson had specifically told Karen to keep an eye on things, and here were two strangers clearly targeting the empty house. When the men began carrying the mysterious bags down the Hendersons' side path rather than approaching the front door, Karen's suspicions crystallized into certainty. This wasn't just about unkempt lawns or unapproved mailbox colors. This was potentially dangerous, perhaps a burglary in progress or worse. Karen's fingers twitched as she reached for her phone, already pulling up the neighborhood watch contact list. But after a moment's consideration, she bypassed it entirely and dialed 911 instead. This situation required immediate professional intervention, not a group text. As she waited for the operator to answer, Karen pulled out her tablet to record video evidence, her hand trembling slightly with a thrill of civic duty and the certainty that she was preventing a serious crime in progress. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, with a slight hint of a southern accent. Karen inhaled sharply, her eyes never leaving the scene across the street. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity. There's a break-in happening, I believe. Or possibly worse." She emphasized the last word, her free hand clutching the collar of her cashmere cardigan. "Can you tell me your location, ma'am?" the dispatcher asked, keyboard clicks audible in the background. "This is 347 Maple Lane in Oakwood Estates," Karen replied crisply, pride momentarily overtaking her anxiety. "I'm observing from my front window. There are two men, very shifty-looking, unloading large, suspicious bags from a beat-up van. They're taking them behind the Henderson residence, and I know for a fact the Hendersons are out of town. Can you describe these men for me?" Karen leaned closer to the window, tilting her head for a better angle. Two men, probably in their 30s. One is taller, maybe 6 feet, Asian or possibly Hispanic. The shorter one looks Middle Eastern, both wearing dark hoodies and jeans. They definitely don't belong in this neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice maintained its professional tone. "What makes you believe they don't belong, ma'am?" Karen scoffed slightly. "Well, this is an established community of professionals. These men look disheveled. And that van is practically falling apart, covered in mud with out-of-state plates. Nobody in Oakwood Estates would drive such a vehicle. I understand. What specifically about their behavior seems suspicious to you?" Karen's frustration mounted at what she perceived as the dispatcher's skepticism. They keep looking around, checking if anyone's watching them. And they're carrying these heavy bags to the side of the house rather than using the front door like normal visitors would. The Hendersons specifically asked me to watch their property while they're in Europe. I've been collecting their mail for 19 days now. Can you see any weapons or tools that might be used for breaking in?" Karen squinted. "Well, no, not exactly. But those bags could contain anything, burglary tools or worse. And why would legitimate visitors sneak around to the back? Do you know if the Hendersons have a back entrance or perhaps a guest house? The question gave Karen momentary pause. Well, yes, they do have a guest house behind the main residence. But Mrs. Henderson would have told me if they were expecting guests. We speak daily. I'm watering her prize-winning roses. I see, the dispatcher said, still typing. Have you approached these individuals or attempted to speak with them? Certainly not. Karen's voice rose an octave. That could be dangerous. That's why I'm calling you people. This is exactly the scenario Officer Ramirez warned us about at the last neighborhood watch meeting. You need to send someone immediately. The dispatcher's voice remained level. We'll dispatch an officer to check the situation, ma'am. In the meantime, please stay inside your home and do not confront these individuals. Can I have your name and a callback number? Karen Whitfield. And I expect an immediate response. She rattled off her phone number. How long will it take for officers to arrive? These criminals could be gone by then. An officer will be dispatched as soon as one becomes available. This has been classified as a routine check based on the information provided. Routine? Karen's voice sharpened with indignation. There is nothing routine about a potential home invasion. I demand this be treated as an emergency situation. The dispatcher, hearing the genuine alarm in Karen's voice, softened her tone slightly. I understand your concern, Ms. Whitfield. An officer will be there as soon as possible. Please call back immediately if you observe any weapons or forced entry. Karen hung up, dissatisfied and convinced the dispatcher hadn't grasped the severity of the situation. She drummed her perfectly manicured nails against the windowsill, her eyes never leaving the two strangers as they continued their suspicious activities at the Henderson residence. Karen paced her living room, a space meticulously decorated in shades of beige and cream with carefully arranged Pottery Barn furniture that had never known the weight of unexpected guests. Her sensible low heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor as she alternated between peeking through the blinds and checking her Michael Kors watch. 18 minutes had passed since her call and still no sign of police. Across the street, the suspicious men continued unloading their cargo. Karen counted 6 large bags now, plus what appeared to be electronic equipment of some kind. The shorter man had removed his hoodie, revealing a faded band t-shirt underneath. Occasionally, they glanced around in what Karen interpreted as guilty surveillance of the neighborhood. They're casing the whole street, she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone again. This time, she opened the neighborhood watch group chat, her thumbs flying across the screen. ALERT, suspicious activity at the Henderson residence. 2 unknown men with van unloading large bags. Police notified but not yet arrived. Stay inside, lock doors, report any similar activity on your street immediately. Within seconds, responses flooded in. You be safe, Karen. Not again. Remember those magazine sellers last summer. Taking extra precautions with the kids. Keep us posted. Harold says he can come over with his golf clubs if you feel unsafe. Karen declined Harold's well-meaning but potentially problematic offer and returned to her vigil. The men had disappeared behind the house now, presumably to the guest house area. 25 minutes since her call, and the street remained devoid of any police presence. Her phone dinged with private messages from several neighbors requesting updates and photos. Karen obliged, zooming in as much as her iPhone would allow to capture grainy images of the van's license plate and the pile of remaining bags. The casual confidence with which these criminals operated infuriated her. In broad daylight, in Oakwood Estates. When 30 minutes passed with no police cruiser in sight, Karen's patience evaporated entirely. She dialed 911 again, her foot tapping an agitated rhythm as she waited for a response. 911, what's your emergency? This is Karen Whitfield at 347 Maple Lane, she began, not bothering to hide her irritation. I reported suspicious individuals at my neighbor's home 30 minutes ago and no officers have arrived. The situation is ongoing. Yes, Ms. Whitfield, I see your previous call. An officer has been dispatched and should arrive shortly. Should arrive shortly? This is completely unacceptable. I pay significant property taxes in this district specifically for prompt police response. I need to speak to a supervisor immediately about this negligent response time. The dispatcher's voice remained professionally neutral. I understand your frustration, ma'am. I can have a supervisor call you back, but I assure you an officer is en route. We've had several priority incidents this afternoon that required immediate attention. And you don't consider a potential home invasion a priority? Karen's voice rose sharply. These men could have emptied the entire house by now. The Hendersons have valuable artwork, you know. The officer is approximately 5 minutes away, Ms. Whitfield. Please remain inside your home and avoid any confrontation with these individuals. If you observe any weapons or forced entry, please call back immediately. Karen ended the call with an indignant huff. 5 more minutes. The suspicious men were now bringing smaller boxes from the van, working with an efficiency that only heightened Karen's suspicions. Professional criminals, clearly. She refreshed the neighborhood watch chat to find 17 new messages, including 3 neighbors reporting they were driving by the Henderson house just to check, despite her warnings to stay away. The situation was escalating beyond her control. Karen grabbed her pepper spray from her purse, a pink canister attached to her keychain that she purchased after the neighborhood watch presentation on personal safety. She slipped it into her cardigan pocket. If the police wouldn't handle this promptly, perhaps it was time for direct intervention. After all, she had promised the Hendersons she would protect their property, and Karen Whitfield always kept her promises. Unable to contain herself any longer, Karen slipped her phone into one pocket and her pepper spray into the other. She straightened her cardigan, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and adjusted her pearl earrings. If she was going to defend her neighborhood, she would do so with dignity and proper appearance. "This is precisely why we have a neighborhood watch," she muttered as she marched down her perfectly swept front walk. Her heart hammered in her chest, but outrage propelled her forward across the pristine asphalt of Maple Lane. 3 houses down, Betsy Miller was pretending to trim her already immaculate hedges while clearly monitoring the situation. Karen gave her a curt nod, a silent communication between neighborhood sentinels. Betsy responded by discreetly pointing to her pocket where her own phone was undoubtedly recording. As Karen approached the Henderson property, she extracted her phone and opened the camera app, holding it at chest level, a technique she'd learned from a YouTube video about citizen journalists. The 2 men were now arranging what appeared to be large metal cases near the guesthouse entrance. Neither had noticed her yet. Karen cleared her throat dramatically. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharper than the pruning shears Betsy was wielding down the street. "This is a private neighborhood. What exactly do you think you're doing?" The 2 men froze, exchanging glances before the taller one set down the case he was carrying and stepped forward. He was younger than Karen had initially thought, perhaps early 30s, with an open, scholarly face partially hidden behind rectangular glasses. He smiled hesitantly. "Hello, can I help you with something?" His accent was slight but noticeable, possibly West Coast with international influences. Karen raised her phone higher, making it obvious she was recording. "You can start by explaining what you're doing at the Henderson residence when they're out of town." She emphasized the last point, establishing her authority and connection to the homeowners. The man's eyebrows rose in understanding. "Oh, I see the confusion. We're just moving in. The Hendersons rented their guest house to us for the semester. I'm James, and this is my brother Michael." He gestured to the shorter man, who offered an awkward wave. Karen's eyes narrowed. The Hendersons didn't notify the HOA about any new tenants. All residents must be properly registered with the Homeowners Association before occupancy. It's in the covenant, Section 4, Paragraph 3. James glanced at his brother before responding. "I'm not familiar with all the regulations, but Mrs. Henderson assured us everything was arranged. We signed the rental agreement last month." "I'm going to need to see some identification and that rental agreement right now," Karen demanded, stepping closer while keeping her phone steady. "The Hendersons would have informed me if they were expecting tenants. I'm their designated property manager while they're away." Michael, who had remained silent, now spoke up. "Look, ma'am, we've been driving for 14 hours from California. All our paperwork is packed away. Can we maybe sort this out after we've unloaded?" "Absolutely not," Karen replied, her voice rising. "For all I know, you could be emptying this house by tomorrow. This neighborhood has standards and procedures." James sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Henderson did mention a neighbor might be vigilant. Would it help if we called her? Though it's the middle of the night in Barcelona right now." "Convenient excuse," Karen scoffed. "The fact remains that without proper documentation and HOA approval, you are effectively trespassing on private property." She took another step forward, hand drifting toward her pocket where the pepper spray waited. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as James attempted to explain while Karen continued recording, insisting they were trespassing until proven otherwise. Michael had retreated to the van, rummaging through a backpack, presumably for documentation. Just as voices began to rise, Karen threatening to call for additional police support and James insisting they had every right to be there. The distinctive sound of an approaching vehicle caught everyone's attention. A white police cruiser with the Oakwood Police Department emblem turned onto Maple Lane, moving at an unhurried pace. Officer Rodriguez approached the scene cautiously, taking in the tableau before him. An agitated, middle-aged woman clutching her phone like a weapon, 2 weary-looking men surrounded by luggage and equipment, and a small audience of neighbors pretending to perform yard work while obviously observing the drama. "Afternoon, folks," he said, adjusting his utility belt as he stepped onto the Henderson property. "I'm Officer Rodriguez. We received a call about suspicious activity at this address." Karen stepped forward immediately. "Yes, officer, that was my call. I'm Karen Whitfield from across the street. She gestured toward her immaculate two-year home. These men claim to be renting from the Hendersons, but they have no documentation, and the Hendersons never informed the HOA or me about any tenants. I'm watching their property while they're in Europe. Officer Rodriguez nodded professionally, his expression neutral as he turned to the two men. Could I see some identification, gentlemen? Of course, officer, the taller man replied, visibly relieved at the calm, official presence. I'm Dr. James Chen, and this is my brother Michael. We've rented the Hendersons' guest house for the semester. He produced a California driver's license from his wallet. Michael followed suit, adding, We've been driving since yesterday morning. Just try and get settled. Officer Rodriguez examined their identification, making notes in his small notepad. And your purpose in Oakwood, Dr. Chen? Research, James explained. I'm a visiting botanist at the University Arboretum. We've been studying drought-resistant native plants. The Arboretum has an exceptional collection. Karen interrupted, That doesn't explain all those suspicious bags and equipment, or why the Hendersons wouldn't tell me about this arrangement when I'm collecting their mail and watering their prize roses every day. Officer Rodriguez held up a hand. Let's sort this out systematically. He turned back to James. Do you have any documentation regarding your rental agreement? Michael spoke up. I found the email thread with Mrs. Henderson. He held out his phone. It has her confirmation about our arrival date and the entry instructions. As Officer Rodriguez reviewed the emails, Karen peered over his shoulder, her frown deepening. Anyone could fabricate those. I want to see an official lease agreement. Ms. Whitfield, please give me some space to conduct my investigation, Officer Rodriguez said firmly but politely. After several minutes of separate conversations with both parties, Officer Rodriguez gestured for Karen to join him a few feet away from the Chen brothers. Ms. Whitfield, I've verified their story, he explained quietly. Dr. Chen showed me his university credentials and appointment letter. The suspicious bags contain soil samples, seedlings, and research equipment. They're legitimate botanists. Karen stood rigid with disbelief, her worldview visibly tilting on its axis. But the Hendersons would have told me. I speak with Eleanor Henderson almost daily. Officer Rodriguez consulted his notes. According to my conversation with Dr. Chen, Mrs. Henderson did mention a neighbor would be watching the property. As for the HOA notification, he flipped a page in his notebook. The Hendersons did send an email to the HOA last month about temporary tenants for the guest house. That's impossible, Karen protested. As HOA vice president, I see all communications. The officer's expression softened slightly. I called the station to verify. They checked the HOA records. The email was sent on February 12th to the official HOA address, subject line guest house rental notification. Henderson property. It appears it may have been overlooked. A flush crept up Karen's neck to her cheeks. February 12th was the day of the contentious HOA meeting about the Wilsons' unauthorized garden gnome collection. The email notifications had been particularly heavy that day, with residents weighing in on both sides of the gnome debate. There must be some mistake, Karen whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She glanced across at the Chen brothers, seeing them now through a slightly different lens, exhausted travelers rather than criminal interlopers. As Karen processed her mistake, a sudden commotion from the guest house caught everyone's attention. Michael Chen was rushing out, phone pressed to his ear, his previously calm demeanor replaced with obvious distress. No, you don't understand, he was saying urgently. These are irreplaceable specimens. We need stable temperature control immediately, or we lose months of work. He looked at his brother with panic. The portable cooling unit is malfunctioning. Temperatures rising fast. Dr. James Chen's scholarly composure cracked. How long do we have? Maybe an hour. The backup batteries were depleted during the drive. Michael ran a hand through his hair. The university facilities won't be ready until tomorrow. I called everyone I know locally. But what exactly do you need? Officer Rodriguez asked, shifting into problem-solving mode. A temperature-controlled environment, James explained rapidly. Around 55 degrees Fahrenheit stable humidity for approximately 20 seedling containers until we can get proper equipment installed. Karen stood frozen, internal conflict visible on her face. The conversation around her seemed distant as she processed the implications of her actions. These weren't criminals. They were scientists whose work was now in jeopardy, partially because her call had delayed their setup. Before fully realizing what she was doing, Karen stepped forward. I have a wine cooler in my basement, she said abruptly. One of those walk-in types with temperature and humidity controls. Would that work? 3 surprised faces turned toward her. A wine cellar? James repeated cautiously. It's set at 54 degrees, Karen continued, her voice firmer now. Cherrywood shelving, no vibration, dual climate zones if needed. Michael looked at his brother with cautious hope. That could actually work for the Sonoran specimens. Officer Rodriguez smiled slightly. Well, this seems like a good solution if Ms. Whitfield is comfortable offering it. 20 minutes later, Karen's pristine dining room had been transformed into what could only be described as an emergency botanical triage center. Her polished mahogany table, usually reserved for holiday dinners and HOA emergency meetings, was now covered with labeled containers, specialized instruments, and several laptop computers displaying colorful charts. Karen watched with fascination and lingering embarrassment as Dr. James Chen carefully transferred delicate seedlings into her prized wine refrigerator. The careful precision of his movements reminded her of herself arranging her award-winning tulip displays. These particular specimens, James explained as he worked, are from regions experiencing extreme drought in Arizona. We're studying their unique water conservation mechanisms. He glanced up at Karen, who was hovering anxiously near her expensive furniture. This cooling unit you've provided may have just saved 9 months of field research. They don't look like much, Karen observed, peering at what appeared to be ordinary sprouts. James smiled. That's what makes them remarkable. These unassuming plants have developed mechanisms to survive where nothing else can. They're incredibly resilient. He sealed the cooler. Our research suggests their root structures could revolutionize crop irrigation in developing regions facing water scarcity. You mean it could help with food shortages? Karen asked, genuine interest overcoming her earlier suspicion. Exactly, Michael chimed in, carefully labeling containers on Karen's dining table. These could be the difference between crop failure and sustainability for communities most affected by climate change. Karen found herself asking increasingly detailed questions about their research methodology and potential applications. The passion with which the brothers spoke about botanical adaptation strategies and environmental resilience was unexpectedly compelling. Their explanations were devoid of condescension, even after her earlier accusations. When Officer Rodriguez prepared to leave, assuring Karen that no report of trespassing would be filed, she felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and relief. As the door closed behind him, she turned back to her transformed dining room and made a decision. Would you like some tea? She asked the Chen brothers. I imagine you haven't had much chance to eat during your drive. I have some cucumber sandwiches I prepared for tomorrow's garden club meeting.